Broadcasting live. It's America's longest running talk show on computers. It's Computer America, bringing you the biggest names in technology with guest interviews, new products, and your emails. Listen live at computeramerica.com on any device around the world. Email the show at live@computeramerica.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out our website for contests, giveaways, show notes, live video stream, podcasts, and more. You're listening to Computer America.
Hello and welcome to the Computer America Show. We are the nation's longest running, nationally syndicated radio talk show on computers and technology. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Ben Crossman, and everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day because we have a great show planned for you with of course, computer and technology news in the second part of the program with lots to talk about, including a couple of leaks. We have a lot of news coming out of Google/YouTube and Huawei and what they're doing with Apple. A lot of very interesting stories. We want to keep you caught up. So second part of the program, time permitting, definitely stick around for that. But in the first part of the show, obviously, we have a guest. And today's guest, really looking forward to it because it is Tuesday. That means this makes this a Gamer Tuesday, where we will be talking with the company Impact Gameworks. And of course, that's the studio behind the game Tangledeep. So if you haven't heard of either one of these, you're in for a treat. So before we get started, a couple of things. computeramerica.com, that's where you'll find everything, including a link to our guest website, a link to the game, anything that we talk about, any articles that we go over, any videos that we show. Anything and everything will be at computeramerica.com right there. Also, be sure to check out the live video feed, and let's see, so there's that. And then also be sure to check out the reviews. We have some new reviews and new articles going up here in just a bit. We'll let you know when those are posted, but keep an eye out. So, all that being said, and more at Computer America, why don't we go ahead and just get started? So, as I said before, today's guest is, of course, a game developer. Some of our favorite guests have been game developers because, there's a lot of work that goes into creating these video games behind the scenes, and it's a great way to see someone's real imagination come to life, and hey, other people get to go on that journey with you. So joining us today is none other than the lead developer behind the game, Mr. Andrew Aversa, and again, lead developer for Impact Gameworks. And why don't we go ahead and bring him on? Andrew, welcome on to Computer America.
Hey there. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. You come in loud and clear. So, okay. And a little bit of an introduction, but as always, we would really appreciate a bit of your background. Tell us when you decided to start working with Impact Gameworks, and have you always been in video games? What's your background?
Well, I grew up in the 90s playing a lot of games, PC games especially, stuff like a lot of obscure things. There are games by companies like Apogee and Epic Games, but then there are some obscure things that aren't talked about as much today, like the Gold Box, Dungeons and Dragons games, and there's an RPG called Castle of the Winds that really captivated me and took a lot of my time and attention, which is basically a dungeon crawler. You had your one square character, you went all over the map. So I spent my time doing that as a kid, and then as I got older, as I got into high school, I got involved with composing and producing music, and I ended up going to college for that, and I became a professional composer for video games. Mm-hmm. And so the influence from playing those early games had an effect on my career, but it wasn't. I didn't think about making a game until just a few years ago. In 2016, I decided to kind of reach back to some of those things that had given me so many fond memories as a kid, and so that is basically how Tangledeep was born, was trying to capture a childhood dream and revive some of that nostalgia with inspirations that I had back then, as well as games that I've played since then, like the Diablo series and Final Fantasy series and things like that. And that brings me to now. So Tangledeep is our first game, but it's on both PC and on Nintendo Switch, which was its own project. And then we're coming out with an expansion for it in a few weeks. So even though the game itself came out last year, it's very much an ongoing project.
That happens so often, where you come out with a game, you come out with something playable, you get it in people's hands, but then you continue to add to it and polish it and do all that kind of thing. Although I will say Tangledeep does look like it has a lot of polish on it. So very positive reviews and things like that. I mean, clearly the effort is there. Let's just take it from kind of a publisher kind of point of view or a developer point of view, where you mentioned that composer, you didn't come at this from exactly a game developer background. Was there something, because you named a lot of games that I've played those, trying to capture the essence of that is one thing. Trying to deliver all those features in all those games is a completely different one. Talk to us about having an idea, wanting to do something, and then realizing, oh wait, that's going to take a lot of man hour and a lot of time and a lot of effort. When you start to develop something like this, were you just like, this is going to be great, but we need to scale it back, or we need to, kind of do something a little bit of a different way? Like, what were some of your bigger challenges to just, make something that you liked, but at the same time, you had to be realistic with it?
It's definitely something that I think a lot of people making video games struggle with, not just independent developers, but even big companies as well.
Sure.
Certainly, entire projects get canned. So when I went into this, I had an awareness that it's very easy to plan for too much and either get discouraged because you plan to do a million, features and all this content. And in the case of an RPG, you can think of tons of items or skills, monsters, things like that. So I had that awareness going in, and I had seen instances where, games were funded on Kickstarter, but they maybe under-delivered, or in some cases didn't deliver at all, which is, even worse. So I tried to, instead of planning out, here's 100 things I want to do, I tried to take it just one step at a time. One day would be, working on one monster and a few skills. The next day would be polishing the interface of the game. The next thing might be making a few different new types of rooms, maybe in the dungeon, something like that. So in doing that, it was sort of like a step-by-step process. I never got overwhelmed, but at the same time, I never started something that was so grand and huge that I couldn't finish it. So right. That was sort of the approach, is just to take it very piecemeal. And maybe I underplanned, but I think it worked out pretty well in the end.
And what you finally came out with, as you said, was a game called Tangledeep. And when out there watching the video portion, we're going to put some gameplay in the background. And I mean, just right away, it immediately takes me back to, me playing Warcraft 1 and the fog of war and the enemies and your character. I think you described it here as roguelike or something, and you could probably give me the right terminology, but it's retro, but I don't think it's dated.
Thank you.
How would you kind of I don't know, the gameplay itself, do you find it engaging? I mean, obviously you've developed this for quite a while. Maybe people who've played it, or you yourself. What's the appeal here? Because first-person shooters are all the rage, battle royales are all the rage. We've went through so many advancements, and yet this is still a very captivating type of gameplay. What do you like about it?
So I think what I've seen from the people playing and enjoying the game, both in the U.S. and also in other countries like Japan, is I think I've seen people in my general age range. So I'm in my lower 30s, and so I've seen people in their 20s, 30s, 40s that kind of grew up playing games with more of a pixel aesthetic on the Super Nintendo, the NES, the Genesis, or again those sort of early PC games in the 80s and early 90s. seeing so that there's sort of like a connection there. It resonates, just the style that we spend a lot of time on. But gameplay wise, it has to deliver there as well. And so I think the gameplay is actually a little bit more of a departure from what one might expect than the visuals, because there's quite a bit of content in the game. There's hundreds of items and skills. There's a very deep system of different properties on the items. So fundamentally, you're taking turns as a single character going through the dungeon. You're planning your next move. So it's got that strategy and tactical element. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the early roguelike games, games like NetHack or Crawl, Stone Soup, things like that, that just had ASCII graphics. A lot of them were sort of based on fairly simple combat. Like you walk up to the monster, you hit it, the monster hits you, you hit it, and kind of going back and forth like that, as opposed to something where there's a system of jobs and classes with all sorts of different powers that can summon objects or pull and push you around the map. So that stuff is inspired more from more modern games like Diablo, Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, these action RPGs that became popular a lot later than roguelikes originally were. So I think what I was able to do with this, and it seems like it has connected with some people, is a game where you have the turn-based strategy element of taking your time, planning your next move, but then bringing in a more modern system of skills and items to make the combat and the exploration a little bit more interesting.
And that is, and a word that you mentioned there a little bit earlier is super important for games nowadays, and content, because I think having a game and sharing your experience is one thing, but then there's things like replay value, and the fact that even games that are released nowadays, like I think gamers are a very practical group of people. And, we haven't talked about price yet. We will a bit later. But the amount of hours that you get out of a game directly influences, I guess, kind of like the feelings you have for the game. If you get lots of hours of enjoyment, then you really enjoy that game. Talk about kind of replayability. What kind of elements of, I'm sorry if I make you repeat yourself, but what kind of elements of randomness are there to, like, let's say you play once and you pick your character, like, is it the kind of character you make, the mage, the warrior, the rogue kind of thing, or is it the skills you do? Where does the replayability come in?
So one thing that we tried to do that is very much inspired by this tradition of roguelikes is the fact that the world itself is different every time. So the items that you find, you won't find the same items in the same place. You won't find the same monsters, the powers that the monsters have. There are things that are shared each time you play the game. Like if you see a simple slime enemy, it's going to have kind of the same general properties. But where you fight that, if it has any sort of special attributes or powers or abilities, that can change from one character to the next. And because the layouts change as well, there's no way to sort of memorize a run through the game. So you could speed run the game, but that's not really the intent. The intent is to ask the player to use their wits, like the player's own wits, to get through a situation. And whether that means using a certain set of equipment that they've sort of crafted and modified to fit their character, or using the right consumable items, or capturing a monster and using it as a pet. There are a lot of ways to get through the game. And what's interesting to me is that I've seen people playing this over the last, let's see, it went into early access originally in July 2017, and then it came out of early access in February 2018. So I have, over a year of watching people play. And it seems like everybody has their own strategy for, here's how I got through it. Here's my favorite way to approach the game. And it's all different. And I think that's because there are so many things that are randomized each time. And we've tried to balance the approaches so that you can use, a sort of a traditional warrior sword and shield type, or you could have a character that's based on summoning other things, or any one of a number of strategies. So I think that's where the replay value really comes in, is different approaches that are all balanced, and then a sort of a different challenge, a different dungeon each time you play.
Now, with all that being said, I'm going to ask you a very biased question, but is this a hard game?
So that's a good question. The tricky thing here is that different people have different definitions of what a hard game is. And in my opinion, it is if I had to say like a difficulty rating where 1 out of 10 is, was it Yoshi's Woolly World or something, where like you can't die and it's just, there's no possible way you can lose. And a 10 out of 10 game is one that, virtually nobody beats. Right. This would probably be a 6 or a 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. But that difficulty is going to change a little bit depending on your approach. If you're the kind of person that enjoys tactical games where you are, you spend time thinking about, do I want to use this piece of armor or this one? Or thinking about, well, here's the scenario. Here are the monsters. Here are the hazards. Let me think about my next move and pick the best approach. If you're that kind of person, it'll be a little bit easier. Then I've seen some people play the game almost not thinking about their next step. They play it like an action game, which is not necessarily the right approach. It'd be like trying to play, Civilization as Warcraft. Like they're strategy games, yes, but it's two different approaches. One of them is more based on your reaction times and your strategy moment to moment. Civilization, you could spend 10 minutes on a turn. It's not to say that either game is necessarily harder or easier, but it's your mindset going into it. Right. So the people that say it's extremely ridiculously hard are often people that haven't had a lot of experience with a sort of turn-based approach.
Well, and you have to admit that there's going to be a number of your audience, just like I said, what's popular today. You can look at your Fortnite, you can look at, Apex Legends lately, but I mean, to a generation that maybe grew up on Call of Duty, this is going to be something different.
Yeah, that's true. And so what we've tried to do is sort of let the player modify the experience a little bit, rather than having a one-size-fits-all difficulty. There's not exactly a difficulty slider in the game like you see in some, again, like FPS games, or even something like Fallout or Skyrim has a kind of a difficulty slider. Instead of that, you can pick primarily, do you want it to be what we call adventure mode, where if you die, you get sent back to town, you lose some resources, but the world doesn't reset. You can go back to where you were. You can try to get through this. Basically, you don't lose any central progress in the dungeon. So if you play that way, then even if you make a mistake, it's not quite as punishing. Whereas the heroic or hardcore modes, if your character dies, you lose most, if not all, of your progress, which is the traditional sort of roguelike approach. So by doing that, we see people that are a little bit newer to the genre. They often pick adventure mode, and they're able to have a lot more fun because they say, well, I'm not used to the turn-by-turn strategy, but they get to learn the game more and more because they're not losing so much with each mistake that they make. Whereas the people that are experts at this genre and they've been playing it for 20 years, they can jump right into the sort of heroic mode. Right. And there's no difference in endings. There's no difference in the story. It's really up to your preference and how you want to enjoy and experience the game.
I've definitely noticed that people get more enjoyment, and it's a very select group of people when they when they put limits on themselves, or when they can have the game put limits on what they can do, they get more fun out of it. It's kind of like playing hardcore as opposed to, just, I guess softcore would be, the opposite of that. And hey, a lot of people definitely get a lot of enjoyment out of that. So, and if you could just, clarify something for me. You mentioned that this was, released out in 2017, I believe you said, or beta, and then talk about the route that you went to publish this. Was this a Kickstarter? Was this Steam Greenlight? How did you go about actually releasing Tangledeep?
So initially, the first thing that we did to fund the game was out of basically my own pocket. It's pretty much just me in terms of full-time people at Impact Gameworks. There are a lot of other people that worked on Tangledeep, but they were freelancers. So freelance writers, freelance art, music. So the first source of funding, it was basically my own pocket. And then once it got to a certain point, I figured in order to get more polish, we wanted to run a Kickstarter. I didn't want to necessarily go with a publisher, although I admit I actually did pitch it to a few publishers at the Game Developers Conference, and we, followed up via email, and I was universally rejected. So that was a fun experience, but that's okay because the Kickstarter went pretty well. It went over the funding goal.
Nice.
And we used that to polish up the art further, the art and the music. Then we released an early access on Steam, and I'm very aware, as somebody that's been playing games, obviously, much longer than I've been making games, I'm aware that some developers use early access in a way that is not fair to the player, let's say. If the game is in a very broken state, or they put something in early access and they say, well, we're going to finish it someday, but there's not necessarily a plan for when that's going to happen. What can end up happening is the game can be in early access for years and then it just sort of gets abandoned. I did not want that to happen, so I had set a release date even before we made the Kickstarter, much less the early access launch, and we stuck pretty closely to that. I think we missed it by 2 months, but that was mainly because of the holidays. We didn't want to release in December, so we figured, now let's do it in February instead. So ultimately, it was self-funded first, then Kickstarter, and then the early access launch helped kind of continue. It brought in some revenue, but it also helped build the hype for the game because it was largely complete at that point, and it was just a matter of sort of continuing to polish it.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that is because you are not the first person to kind of be a one-man publisher and come on the show here. It's and honestly, it's some of our favorite because they get to see something that they created, put out there, and it's sometimes it's some of the more innovative games that we've talked about on the show. Because don't get me wrong, it's great when we have like a Bungie or something like that come on the show and talk, but at the same time, it's like there's so much that goes into a game like that where you have thousands and thousands of man hours that making the game kind of gets lost on people, and you're much more obviously kind of in the trenches would be a saying. So I wanted you to speak to, I guess, people who maybe want to follow in your footsteps, make something, create a game. We get a lot of entrepreneurs here on the show, so we'd like to give some of that entrepreneurial spirit or advice. Let's start with the Kickstarter. How was your experience with crowdfunding, and what would you say was kind of a success there? Was it a clear goal? Was it clear updates? And just talk about maybe just doing something like this from an entrepreneur point of view. What advice would you give yourself?
Sure. So I think with Kickstarter, much like early access, in a way it's been, this might be a strong word, but it's been a little bit poisoned by people that are not acting in good faith. People that run a Kickstarter and they don't deliver on it, or they deliver a very small part of it. And we've seen these very high profile sort of scandals. So my approach, and what I would say to anybody else, is to start small and don't start with a Kickstarter. When I began working on this game, I got onto forums, I got onto Discord, and I started showing it at a very early stage, before I would even think about charging anybody for it, and just offering it as a free download to get feedback and to start sort of gathering people that might be interested in seeing how the game would progress. So that was sort of the beginning of the community for the game, and I think having a community is essential to doing a Kickstarter, unless you're very lucky or you have some sort of big name behind you, which I have a little bit of a following because of the music that I've written. Not like a major label artist. Again, it's also very independent, but some people know me through my music. So I had some people from there, and then the people that were interested in following the game from the early development. So if you're looking to make a game or really do anything on Kickstarter, the first step is to find people that might be interested and get them to follow it, so that you have some fans before you even think about asking for more money. And then starting small also means not doing something that is like $100,000 so that we can finish the game in 2 years. I think it's more fair to everybody, and it's actually better for the developer too if you put in more of that work early on. Have something playable, have something that even if it's simple, even if it's like half an hour of gameplay, but just to show that you've put in your own effort and your own time and in some cases your own money, depending on what skill set you have. Show that you can do that, because that shows that you're invested in your own work, which you should be as a creator. You should be invested in what you're doing. The projects that I think that have gone off the rails on Kickstarter are the ones where somebody says, well, I have an idea for something and I haven't really put much time into it. Their time has only gone into the Kickstarter campaign itself, and there's nothing to show for the actual product or game. Yeah. I think that's a little bit riskier, and I wouldn't recommend that route.
I have seen that as well. It's and I think poison's definitely a pretty good word for it, but it's people who think that they can start or really just do everything with a single Kickstarter, and that's not really what Kickstarter is for. Just like its name implies, it's to kind of give you kind of give you like a jump start. You should have something to jumpstart. You can't jumpstart nothing. So hey, very, very good advice. Thank you for giving that. Now, of course, people may be wondering, you've done the Kickstarter, you've done the early access, you have a game. People can go out and play it right now if they wish to. So people may be wondering, why are they on Computer America right now? Well, first of all, we like this kind of thing. Second of all, I believe you're here because recently you launched on the Nintendo Switch, if I'm not mistaken. So, launching something for PC through Steam is one experience. Talk about launching this through Nintendo Switch.
So, in my understanding of video game development is that it used to be very, very difficult to do something on a console. You had such intense technical restrictions. I can't speak to that because I never developed a game for, say, the Nintendo 64 or something like that. But with Switch, we were pleasantly surprised that so much of what we had done was we could get that onto Switch without really compromising the content. Back in the day, like you had mentioned Warcraft. I remember, I think StarCraft for the Nintendo 64 and other sort of ports from PC to console. Oftentimes they'd really be kind of butchered. Like you'd lose some content or the graphics would get downgraded or something. And even though Switch is not anywhere near as powerful as some of the other consoles out there now, it is still more than enough for something like this. It's a 2D game, and so we were able to basically move everything over without sacrificing all of that content that I was talking about before. So the tricky part was in dealing with my own inexperience with my early code, because when I started this game, I didn't have a lot of experience programming. I had to learn. I put the time into learning, of course, but I guess it's what you would call technical debt. There are things like UI that I wasn't thinking about console at the beginning, so I designed things assuming you would have a keyboard and a mouse, even though you could still play it with a gamepad on a PC. There's playing with a gamepad and also having access to a mouse, and then there's playing on a console where obviously there's no possible way you can connect a mouse to it. So a lot of the time was spent kind of optimizing the game for that console experience. Just getting it to run on the Switch at all wasn't that hard, but it was that optimization process that took the better part of a year to really get it up to our standards.
I gotcha. So I'm going to ask this next question, but Andrew, if you don't mind, we're going to head to break in about a minute, so I might have to interrupt you, but I wanted to ask you this question, and if you don't mind staying over, of course.
Sure.
Oh, perfect. So, all right. So let's go ahead and start with this, and then we'll, less than a minute. All right. So when we come back, actually, I'm going to ask you a question about how has the reaction been in Japan? And it seems very specific, but I'm sure that there's a reason we're going to ask that. But Andrew, we're about to head to break, so we'll be right back with you. Everyone else out there, we're talking with Andrew Aversa. He is the lead developer for Impact Gameworks, who is, of course, the creator of Tangledeep. If you want to see more, check out the video portion, computeramerica.com. And, of course, go check out Tangledeep available at Steam Storm, GOG, so many other places. Everyone, we'll be right back. More Computer America and more Tangledeep right after this. Everyone, stay tuned.
Greece is cheap.
But the airfare costs a fortune.
Paris?
Not much closer, and again, airfare...
What about Puerto Vallarta?
Let's face it, flying anywhere is just too expensive.
Wait, what's this? Low-cost airlines.
With one call to low-cost airlines, you'll drastically slash your travel costs. We're talking insanely low airline prices to any of your favorite destinations. Where would you like to go? London, Rome, Costa Rica, Australia?
Wow, that's cheap.
So why wait? Call now to learn how crazy cheap it is to fly anywhere in the U.S. or international. Our prices are so low, we can't publish them. The only way to get them is to call to instantly hear the most amazing best deals on airline travel. It's that easy. So call now and start packing.
800-215-4461. 800-215-4461. 800-215-4461. That's 800-215-4461.
We are all Brother Wolf. 10 years ago, a group of locals banded together to create positive change. We took animals into our homes, held adoption events at local retailers, and talked to the community about our mission to help build a no-kill Asheville. A decade later, we have achieved so many victories for animals in need. There's been so much progress, yet there's still so much to do. As part of our year-long celebration, we encourage you to become a member of our special Compassionate Circle program. With a monthly donation of $10 or more, you will have behind-the-scenes access to the work we are doing at Brother Wolf. Our goal is to reach 1,000 members because we receive no government funding. Working together, we can help build and sustain no-kill communities. Learn more at compassionatecircle.bwar.org. We are a 501c3 tax-deductible organization.
And welcome back to the Computer America Show. It is 32 minutes past the hour as we continue on here. And everyone, if you've missed any part of our conversation so far with of course, our guest, then hey, wherever podcasts are heard, simply type Computer America. We should pop right up. And you can listen to today's interview in its entirety after the show. So there's a live radio portion here. And then after the program, we simply just distribute this as a podcast. So everyone, if you're busy, if you commute, if you want to time shift us, that would be the best place to do it. But for everyone out there joining us on the radio, thank you so much. Now, we continue on. We are talking with the developer behind Tangledeep. It's a game available through many different platforms. And let's see, they're all listed on your site. We're going to include a link to that in the show notes, tangledeep.com. Let's see, so Steam, GOG, eShop, Oz eShop, Japan eShop. And speaking of Japan eShop, that is about where we were just about to leave off. So Andrew, thank you for continuing on with us through the break. But just before the break, we were going to ask you, how has the reaction been in Japan?
So the reaction in Japan has been surprising and overwhelming, which is something I never in a million years would have expected. It seemed like what happened was when the game was in early access, we somehow attracted some attention from a few major Japanese video game blogs, basically. And obviously, I couldn't read most of the text, but just Google Translate alone.
Right.
Sorry about that. My mic just freaked out. Anyway. So seeing these blogs talk about the game sort of got us thinking. We weren't at the time planning on translating the game to Japanese, but once it launched out of early access in February 2018, we started putting some time into a Japanese translation. And that came out in May 2018. And at that point, we saw what was essentially a second launch for the game. Now, normally on Steam, or really any platform, that first week, that's sort of like the most you're ever going to get in a 1 week period. That's the people that are most interested in the game. They're going to see it when it first comes out. And then as time goes on, the interest, generally goes down because, it's no longer a new game. Mm-hmm. But what we saw in May was all of a sudden now all of these Japanese players that had been interested in following the game since those early articles, all of a sudden they could play it, and it spread like wildfire. And we saw almost over the course of just a couple of weeks, our player base went from maybe 7-8% Japanese to like 33% Japanese. So one of the biggest countries, I think it's after the US in terms of our player base list, which is almost unheard of, because the population there, even though it's a developed country with a strong economy, they don't buy a lot of Western indie games.
Right.
It's just not something that usually happens. And I think I can attribute that in part to the aesthetic of the game. The music and the sound effects and the art is very much inspired by, JRPGs, Japanese RPGs from the 90s. So I think that it connected to people. But then there was that element of just, for whatever reason, just on the social media there, it really caught on. And we saw the same kind of thing then when the Switch version came out just a few weeks ago. It is, as of now, I think 50% Japan and 50% everywhere else. Again, I never would have imagined that it would possibly be like that. I wasn't trying to do that when we started the game, but I'm just so glad that we decided to put the time into a good Japanese translation.
Yeah, and obviously anyone out there who sets out and says, sounds like Japan is really in the mood for some roguelike dungeon crawling. No, it's kind of like a viral video. Like you really can't go out and search for it. It's just going to happen or it's not. And I'm very happy it happened for you. So obviously that's why that question was in there. And then just kind of overall, if you just want to give us a rundown of what the reviews have been for the game, elsewhere besides Japan. Have people liked it? Have people said, this brings me back? How has the reception been to Tangledeep?
I'm really happy. When I started this, I didn't know how it was going to be received. I was looking at it as, this is a passion project. I'm doing it because I enjoy the process. It's not because I was trying to sort of switch careers necessarily, even though that's basically what has happened. But it's the reviews on Steam have been consistently very positive. So hovering at about 90% positive. So when it comes to critics, on PC, it didn't get anything on Metacritic just because there's so many games these days. Generally, the games that get the big Metacritic reviews are like AAA almost exclusively. It's hard to kind of get anybody's attention. But also, I'm not sure it really matters anymore because my experience talking to people playing the game, the people emailing me and posting on social media, has been really, really positive. A lot of people, definitely saying that it evokes that nostalgia for earlier games. But the nice thing is that I think people have also responded positively to the changes in the content and the depth and complexity of it, where, a game like Secret of Mana for Super Nintendo, which is one of my favorite games. If you go back and play it today, which I did, it is a little simple. It's a little repetitive. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of these things that we might expect from a modern RPG, skill trees, crafting, all these elements that you might want to have. And like I was mentioning before, we wanted to put more of that depth into Tangledeep. So it wasn't just trying to recreate, a retro game. It's using that retro aesthetic, but sort of building on it. And it seems like people have responded to that well. And so I'm very happy with the reaction.
Yeah. But at the same time, I've seen it before where, things like skill trees and crafting, they're all well and good when they're well implemented. But if you just have them in there just to have them in there, then they become a chore. They become kind of a barrier to fun. So not necessary. And I'm sure if you get around, if you put in the content in the right way, it's going to be perfect. So with that being said, I'm a little remiss that we're 40 minutes into this and just now asking this, but for everyone out there who maybe is just listening to this segment, why don't you go ahead and kind of give us a rundown, like the segment here on the Steam store, the setting and, kind of the mission. What are you trying to do in this game?
Tangledeep at its heart is a dungeon crawler, and that means at the most basic level, you're trying to get from the bottom of the dungeon, in this case, to the top. You start the game in a safe, peaceful, underground society. There's a lot of colorful characters, NPCs, shopkeepers and things like that. And you're sent into this labyrinth to explore. The labyrinth starts out with these very natural environments and biomes. So you're fighting monsters that are very, kind of like simple beasts that you might expect to see. Everything's very lush, very green, lots of trees. As you continue ascending through the labyrinth, which nobody has ever done before, nobody's made it to the top, you begin to find more and more strange things about it, things that don't add up. You begin to find different kinds of creatures, humanoids. Eventually, you begin to find things that resemble machines of different kinds. And so it's exploring a dungeon to reach the top is your goal as a player. But you're also trying to unravel this mystery of how did this labyrinth get here? Why is it always changing? Why does it go from being a sort of like a natural environment to something that begins looking maybe a little bit more artificial, and so forth and so on. So that's the driving force. The setting is it's basically entirely unique to this game. Obviously, it's inspired by other things, but it's not something with elves and dwarves or D&D influenced. All the characters I just made up. The monsters are all, for the most part, made up, aside from some basic things like slimes. Of course, you're going to find slimes in pretty much any RPG. But I tried to come up with different ideas for things like, instead of necromancy, with undead and skeletons, instead there's a floramancy. So you're summoning vines and vine walls and plants and things like that. So everything has a little bit of a spin on it to make it just a bit different than the, I guess you would call the high fantasy tropes out there. There's a little bit of that, but tried to push it a bit outside those bounds.
And of course there that makes perfect sense. Tangledeep. Now I can see where that comes in, but and on top of that, I'm not saying that you have to justify this decision or that you did this for any particular reason, but the protagonist is a girl, and very clearly. I mean, kind of the only reason I bring this up is because you have a female protagonist tag on Steam. When you're thinking of ideas for, like, a big part of an RPG is the character that you make, the hero and their adventure. Was this always the intention? Did you have someone in mind that you were trying to do, or was this just like, hey, you know what? When we're creating this world, this is going to be our heroine. This is just how it's like. Where did the inspiration for your protagonist come from?
Sure. Well, it's kind of funny because people from in the Steam forums for the game have approached this and said, why can't I play as a male character, and sort of attributing different reasons to this. Why did you pick this? Why don't you allow for character creation? And to the thing that led us to having a specific character with a specific appearance, and obviously you can change classes, or we call them jobs in the game. That changes the way your character looks, but fundamentally it's the same person. The reason for that is essentially a budgetary restriction. Having like a male and female protagonist would mean twice as many sprites that we have to draw and all the different animations and so forth. And because the budget is not huge, once the artist had drawn this character and we began animating it, and I sort of realized, well, we're only going to have enough money. We could either have 12 jobs with lots of great animations, different sorts of attacks and walking, running, and different angles and so forth, or we could have half as many animations and have two different playable characters. So once we had that sort of restriction, once that restriction was sort of understood, then I thought, well, since we're not going to be able to offer that kind of customization of appearance, let's approach this more like a console RPG, where instead of creating a character totally from scratch, the character is a person in the world already. So just like the Sheeran the Wanderer mystery dungeon games, you play as Sheeran. That's your character, and you get to customize the character, but like fundamentally it's somebody in the story. Or a game like Secret of Mana, where you have your three characters, but again, they're in the story and they're just already in the world. So we kind of ran with that restriction and try to make the best of it, basically. And I'd say, with all that being said, one of my favorite stories, which was in anime and also a manga, was Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind, which has a protagonist that our protagonist ended up looking awfully similar to in some ways in terms of the hairstyle and everything. And I just thought it was nice that it turned out that way, because I really enjoyed that story. So even though that wasn't the intent from day one, we just made the best of that restriction.
Right. No, and hey, I think it's I'm sorry. There's definitely a very good way to approach it. And hey, maybe just the next one, your next game, you can say character creation coming, but for the limitation that you had, you turned it into a feature, and that works perfect. So you have your character, you're playing as them, and you gave us a setting. That's great. Now, when you talk about a game like this, you mentioned that, you mentioned that it's kind of ongoing. It's a continuing conversation. If you look on Steam, you have different patches. Just within the last couple of weeks, you've had 2 different patches, and obviously you're giving constant updates. What are some of the future plans for Tangledeep? Is there, and I'm not demanding that you tell us exactly what you're going to do, but are you looking into added content to what you maybe were restricted to before? Are you looking at Tangledeep 2? What's kind of your feeling on Tangledeep?
In the near future, so in early March, the plan is to release the game's first expansion, which is going to be a new story with a new character. That's actually a character that you encounter in the regular game. So it's somebody that the players already know. And that's going to add also a higher level cap, a new playable job, new items. Basically, it's chock full of new stuff and different, not just new monsters and new areas, but sort of new ways to approach the game as well. So been working on that for the better part of maybe 8 or 9 months, sort of interspersed with the Switch work. So that's going to be a big new piece of content. And the reason I was calling it an expansion, technically, yes, it's DLC. But when I think of my favorite experiences with expansion packs on PC, games like really, especially the Blizzard games in particular, like you get Diablo 2, but then you get Lord of Destruction. That just took the game and made it better pretty much across the board. I wanted to kind of have that same feeling with this expansion, where whether you're at the start of the game or the end of the game, or you've played it for 5 hours or 50 or 500, you're going to find a whole bunch of new stuff to enjoy in the expansion. So that's sort of the near future plan. There's a second expansion that I've been working on as well. Basically we had so much content for the first one that I decided, there's already so much, like let's postpone some of it to polish and work on even more. So I think a second expansion, possibly by the end of this year, is a possibility. But if the first expansion, if people don't react to it, and they say, well, not too interested in this, which I hope is not the case. But if it is, then what we might do is just make the second one, smaller scale and just release it as like a big patch, basically. Right. So it sort of depends on the reaction to the first one, how much more time and resources we can put into the second one. Beyond that, I'm very interested in eventually making a Tangledeep 2, which would be more of an action role-playing game. So more like something like Diablo or Phantasy Star Online, another game I really enjoyed. So trying to keep strategy and tactical elements, but also bringing in something of a real-time element as well. So that's in the future, though, probably years away at this point. For now, my focus is definitely still continuing to refine this. Also, the Switch version, of course, is going to get its own patches because it's now a different code base. So I'm continuing to work on that.
I gotcha. And so it obviously you said this was your first game, and it sounds like you really enjoyed it. And you know, to kind of a holistic sense, you enjoy making video games. This is something you can see yourself doing again.
Absolutely, yeah. Even though I wrote a lot of music for this game, and since that's more of my professional background, and I will probably continue to write music. It's gone from audio being a full-time job to now game development is a full-time job, and everything with audio is more of like a part-time thing, which is fine though, because I really enjoy this.
Well, and that's one thing I wanted to highlight as well, because you said that you came from a composer's background, and I see here available on Steam. You can get the bundle where you get the soundtrack standalone. We talked about the reception for the game itself, which has been very, very positive. Talk about what people have been saying about the music, and maybe what kind of effort went into composing music for a video game.
The reaction to the soundtrack has also been very positive, which I'm very grateful for, because I'd say I put the most heart into that. I grew up listening to games like Final Fantasy 3 or 6, Chrono Trigger, things like that. These classic timeless soundtracks, and even as I got older, listening to arrangements and remixes from a lot of those. It was a big part of my music library. So I wanted to go back and use those games as a major inspiration and starting point for the soundtrack. I've written hundreds of pieces of music, so I was able to apply a lot of that experience to this. One thing that specifically I wanted to do was to match the pixel aesthetic of it. I wanted it to really sound like a high quality Super Nintendo game, because again, that was sort of like my the period of gaming that I have the fondest memories for is the Super Nintendo era. So I used a tool that I actually also made that allows you to use, without getting too technical, use the same kind of sounds that were on Super Nintendo soundtracks, as well as Nintendo and Genesis and so forth. But I was focusing more on the Super Nintendo. So not only compositionally, the tracks they sound like heavily influenced by a lot of those classic games, and it seems like people have enjoyed them just as much, which is great. But also the sound of the instruments themselves is supposed to emulate that as well, and I think that's something that I managed to do pretty well. And it doesn't quite, it's not 100% like you couldn't actually load this on a SNES cartridge, but it definitely has that feeling to it. And that's, at the end of the day, it was the feeling that I wanted to try to evoke in people when they hear this. And I think I was able to do that.
I completely understand. So, and let me see if I can, let's see, where's this? Actually it's available on Spotify. Who knew? Very, very interesting. You made it so that the soundtrack itself is also very accessible. So obviously you put a lot of work into that. And that was actually one of our last questions, which were, that was actually our last question, which was, what sort of tools did you use to make this game? And so you create your own instruments, and was there anything else there to highlight?
In terms of the core engine that was used, we used a tool called Unity, which is very, very popular for game development now, and it helped allow us to create not just the Windows version, but also the Mac and Linux versions very easily. And then it really helped with the Switch version as well. It did a lot of the groundwork for us. So that was sort of the core tool. From the audio perspective, the tool in particular that I use is called Super Audio Cart, which hopefully any fans of the SNES will appreciate that kind of that reference there. Artwork, even though I didn't do the artwork, but there's a wonderful tool called Sprite, spelled ASE Sprite, and that is just a fantastic tool for pixel art, animating pixel art And obviously with the game having so much of that, that was really essential. Otherwise, a surprising amount of the game is contained in just pure text files. So the stats a monster has, the way abilities work, the way items work. I wanted everything to be sort of accessible with just a plain text editor, which helps facilitate player modding. You don't need to have a sort of a special tool or utility to sort of see the game's content. So I'd say a vast majority of the development time was spent in front of a text editor, just editing either the data for the game or the code for the game. So just kind of goes to show that you don't necessarily need really fancy tools or fancy hardware unless you're making like a cutting edge 3D thing with 3D models and so forth. But there's quite a bit you can do with just text.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk the very obvious. I mean, if people want to find it, if people want to download it, where do you recommend they go? And talk about price and how much this is.
The simplest and most straightforward way to get links to the game would be just Tangledeep.com, because that has links to Steam, Good Old Games, and then the Switch eShop. So the PC version, the base price is $15. It is often on sale throughout the year. So if you're really on a budget and you can afford to wait, a few months for a holiday sale on Steam, we usually have it on sale during the holidays as well as on Good Old Games. The Switch version is $20, and the reason it's a little bit more is because there's a lot of extra work that went into it, but also because there's some content that's exclusive to Switch, so it has a bit more than is on PC. So there's that as well on the eShop as a download, and going forward, there's for the. Let's see. So then for the expansion content, we'll do some sort of a bundle with that. It'll probably be $20 to get the base game and the expansion, which more or less doubles the amount of stuff in the game in terms of just sheer possible gameplay hours, I would say. So I think for anybody if this sounds like something you would enjoy, I would definitely recommend once this expansion is out in just a few weeks as of now, so early March, that would be something I would definitely recommend, because I think it'll enhance your experience.
All right. Well, and of course, there's always the feature through a lot of these where you can kind of put things on watch lists. But thank you for letting us know about the expansion. I didn't know about that before we started talking, so that's very exciting. Of course, I'm looking to get into this myself, so it's going to be on my watch list. Looking forward to the expansion. And in the meantime, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for coming here onto Computer America and just not only sharing us about the game, but about your experience as a developer. This is you should be really proud. This looks really cool.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. So everyone, again, this is a lead developer for Impact Gameworks and, of course, Tangledeep, Andrew Aversa. And Andrew, until next time, good luck, best of luck on the expansion and, of course, the sequel. And, be sure to keep us updated.
You got it. All right. Have a good rest of the show.
Yep. And have a great one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, everyone, and there he goes. So obviously, Andrew Aversa, if you want to check that out, you can, we have links in the show notes, computeramerica.com, links to that. Folks, we don't have a lot of time left. We have only about a minute. So with that being said, some of the stories that we were going to get to, but hey, listen, the show is primarily formatted to allow plenty of overtime for our guests, plenty of time to talk, and if you... if this happens, we're more than happy to accommodate. This is our favorite part, talking with our guests. So some of the topics that we didn't get to, though, when it comes to computer technology news, if you were so interested, you can check out some of these, including Google, speaking of video games, and you may know that Google has dabbled in the arena of game streaming services, and Google has set a March 19th announcement date for a big gaming announcement. And that is that they are probably going to launch a streaming service called Project Stream. And if you don't know what this is, it means that you could have some of the best games available to you, even if you have some of the worst hardware available to anyone. let's say your computer is really bad or really, just hasn't been upgraded in a while, then you would subscribe to Google. There's music. You would subscribe to Google, and you could stream AAA games looking their best to your PC, and all of the computational power would be done elsewhere. So it's not ideal for everything, but it's going to put a lot of games into a lot of people's hands and make them look amazing. Everyone, stories like that. YouTube has redone their copy strike. There were some Samsung leaks you can check out, but overall, I think that's just about it. So everyone, the music means that we are done. Be sure to tune in tomorrow. We have a segment that we did with IBM. Yeah, you know them. They make almost everything server. And we're going to be talking all about quantum computing. A very interesting segment. You definitely want to tune in for that. If you don't know what quantum computers are, we have their lead scientist behind the whole project over at IBM Research. Check it out tomorrow, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern. Everyone, have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.